Um, Today, we come to one of the books. Now, of course, all of these books that we've been dealing with, whether it be the aesthetics or the phenomenology of spirit, or indeed the philosophy of history, philosophy of religion, whatever, all of them could take 20, 30 lectures in their own right. So the fact that we squash them into four and you seem to be coping is well, it's more a compliment to you than it is to me, but this is no different. The philosophy of right is not, as you can see, even from the introduction, those of you who haven't read the book, but even from the introduction that I sent to you, you can see how disorganized a book it is. I mean, there are bits of notes tagged onto the main paragraphs and so on, and appendices galore. And of course, these are, as is most of Hegel's works, the result of students posthumously adding notes and interpretations and appendices to enlighten further the dense. And Hegel wasn't a very charismatic person, you know, in terms of his own persona. For those of you who want to learn more, there's a great little book by Walter Kaufmann on Hegel, in which he intersperses reflections, Walter Kaufmann, in which he intersperses analyses of the main texts with Hegel's letters, facts about his life, and about his dealings with students and so on. And what comes across is that he was, although a very well-intentioned man and a brilliant genius, of course, he wouldn't set the world alight. And his mind was so overbaked that he found it difficult to express himself even at a normal person-to-person level, which attests to the fact that his writing is difficult and abstruse at times and so on. Sometimes impenetrable, you might say. And yes, most Hegel scholars would agree with you. But nonetheless, the overall drama that's played out there is anything but lacking in personality and so on. So, but this book, The Philosophy of Right, does entail those features of being kind of tacked together by students and acolytes and colleagues, but nonetheless, it is one of his clearest expositions, along with the aesthetics, if you can apply that adjective to him at all, and that's that you can dispute. Now, I will say this in relation to Fish's opening remarks as well, and the title of this lecture series, which you know, it sits very uncomfortably with me. From my perspective, there is no conservative Hegel and there is no liberal Hegel, there is just Hegel. The fact that a group of left-wingers took hold of his theory of history and used it to promote a non-idealistic agenda, a materialistic agenda, which ended up corrupting intellectual thought for the next 2.5 years, is not Hegel's fault. I said this at the outset. It's the fault of Marx and his acolytes, Feuerbach and so on, who really take Hegel, as the old expression goes, hackneyed as it is, and turn him on his head. You know, say Marx took Hegel's dialectic and turned it on its head. Well, that's to disfigure Hegel. That's not to be true to Hegel. And if any book proves that this certainly wasn't Hegel's original intention, The Philosophy of Right is it. I mean, it's the philosophy of law. It's the philosophy of statehood. It's the philosophy of institutions. It's the philosophy of constitutional monarchy. Where in the left is there room for constitutional monarchy? You know, where isn't in the left, and certainly now with the clamors across the great bastion of freedom to my west, where where the clamors for defunding the police, where is that in Hegel? No, there's a robust defense of the police force and corporations. There's a robust defense of the executive and the legislature. All of these things that we take for granted in advanced industrial democracies, in the free world, in other words. And it's certainly not the world that was bequeathed to us by Karl Marx, and it's certainly not the world bequeathed to us by the fascist totalitarians either, by any stretch of the imagination, as we'll go on to see today. This book is a book, I mean, if ever there was a book of politics or political philosophy or even moral theory that you're going to read, that you can situate yourself in and understand all the debates, even the current debates between liberalism and communitarianism, between conservatism and the liberal theory, let's say, of John Stuart Mill or whatever, economic theories, liberal and conservative, then all you do is go and read the philosophy of right, and you've got them there. He anticipates them all. But we've got a bit of ground to cover before we get to the end and see how that happens. The first thing I will say to you is that never read this book or any of the books in isolation from the whole dynamic that's going on that we've tried to outline to you these past few weeks. Always see it as this kind of realization of consciousness, or by consciousness, of itself in the world. Once you do that, once you realize that we're beginning from this point of alienation and we're moving dialectically towards self-recognition, full self-recognition in the world, in and through the world, and once you see that played out in all the texts, then you'll easily be able to slot the texts into their rightful place within the dialectic. I said that in this case, I called it Coming Home, and it's simply because we've dealt with the great drama of selfhood in the phenomenology. We've dealt with how the art mirrors or reflects representationally consciousness becoming aware of itself in the world and realizing that it is the world. It is the mirror through which it sees itself. And therefore art shows us how this happens pictorially, you know, within the various artworks, within the various epochs of art. And so we see in a very dramatic and representational form consciousness coming to an awareness of itself in and through the way art changes, in and through the way art modifies and becomes more spiritually full and materially depleted. So it's a pictorial, it's a concrete drama that goes on in parallel to the dialectic of consciousness. So you can actually see through our art where we are or where we've come from in terms of the dialectic of consciousness. And all the while you see this liberation of consciousness from the material bondage in which it originally perceived itself. Now remember, it wasn't as though that were the case, because remember, everything happens within consciousness. And so we're all the while, as this is happening, this is the move from bondage to freedom, from alienation to this independence, where we're at home in the world, where consciousness sees itself mirrored everywhere. And there's no area of experience where you do not see oneself or see spirit, and therefore the world becomes a home instead of a place of threat or a place of alienation or a place of bondage. The philosophy of history is another one of those texts, which shows how freedom works through, begins, again, we start in total alienation and we work towards full self-actualization and therefore to full freedom. And the reason I bring up these texts now is because I want you again to slot the philosophy of right into place, but I also want to say that the drama that plays out in the philosophy of history, which again is one of his more tangible texts because it takes concrete examples, of historical epochs and shows how the dialectic plays out in each one, it's a companion piece to the philosophy of right. There's an ever-growing awareness of freedom in and through these historical epochs, starting with the Oriental world, where the subject, the ancient Oriental world now, where the subject does not see him or herself reflected in the fabric of the state or the polity or whatever it is at all. There is but one person who is free, and that is the autocratic ruler, who self-proclaimed God, of course. So you feel, again, the subject feels totally alien from the political order of which it is a part. Of course, slavery is the order of the day, and therefore you are physically in bondage, but also mentally and consciously in bondage. You do not see yourself reflected at all. In fact, just like we spoke about in terms of art and in terms of the general dialectic of spirit in the phenomenology, there is no recognition, no self-recognition. The subject is conscious, but not self-conscious of himself as a political agent or as having any part to play in this political order. They may as well be dead, actually, and for most of them, death was a lucky escape. The transition then, and I'm abbreviating this because I want to get onto the philosophy of right, but I just want to show you how the philosophy of history works into it. The Oriental world gives way now to the Greek world, which is a very different world, of course, a more enlightened world where the subjects, to a degree, see themselves reflected in the body politic. There is more of an engagement. The world, the material world, becomes more spiritualized, as per the dialectic of art last week. Through this free interaction, this free play of reason and reflection, which is, of course, characteristic of the Greek city-state. And but there is one problem, that the individual sees himself reflected or herself reflected totally in the state, to the degree where there is no independent, rational reflection on whether the customs or the traditions of the state are rational, whether they're not mere prejudices. They don't question them. And of course, the whole point of Hegel's dialectic is that you're consciously aware of the other in terms of recognition. You know, there's a reciprocal recognition. You see yourself fully reflected in the other because you have died to yourself, you've grappled with it, you've shaped it in your own image and likeness, and then you come back to yourself unified and made whole. That doesn't happen in the Greek city-state. And what's more, there is slavery. There is a rather large class of people who are still actually in bondage. So there's a facade of freedom, as it were, but it's not true freedom in Hegel's rational sense, which is why you need the likes of Socrates to come along and jolt the Greek city-state from its slumbers. Socrates is a threat to the Greek city-state because Socrates thinks, and thinks through the rationale of the political order of which he's a part, questioning it, upturning it, questioning its assumptions, it's questioning its moral codes, pitting the good against a kind of utilitarian form of morality, where the end justifies the means and so on. And he pays for his life with that. Because it's anathema, it's alien to the order of which he's a part. But in time, the Greek city-state will learn from that and will evolve to a point where the likes of Aristotle will be institutionalized in the Greek city-state. And so it's something very different from what it was in its original form. But of course, that must give way because it is a limited form of consciousness, and self-recognition is indeterminate to a degree, and therefore it gives way to the Roman world. The advance of the Roman world now is that there is a system of law and a constitution. System of law and a constitution. So it's the first time we've seen serious laws that in and of themselves determine the political order, stand at the heart of the political order, which the people can identify with. But of course, they cannot be, the individuals in the state are still subject, despite that, it's a merely formal thing, despite that they are still subject to the whims of an emperor. They are still subject to the whims of people who don't share the lot of the ordinary man, and therefore those who really think and genuinely think through the social order that they're a part of, which they're a part, must do so within the mind alone. And this is why, even in the likes of Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, you will recall, you have this inward turn away from the social substance, this inward turn, where real freedom, mental, conscious, rational freedom can be exercised in terms of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and so on, and skepticism. And this is an abdication from one's participation in the state, as it were, where there's limited, very, very circumscribed degree of freedom and association, and therefore recognition of oneself as part of the organic whole, or what Hegel likes to call the social substance. And I'll just describe what that means more fully later. But you withdraw inwardly, and there's freedom of the mind. But of course, that is only a very kind of limited form of freedom, because we want to see ourselves reflected in the world. It's a deceptive sort of thing. It's what Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit calls the beautiful soul, where the slave, and the master and slave dialectic, although more free than the master, is still in bondage. He's still a slave. So in order to escape that particular situation, that particular predicament, knowing, of course, that he is more free than the master, but of course the master is still master and determines his fate, he too withdraws into silent and interior contemplation. But that is no freedom at all. That is simply another form of bondage. Now, of course, it can be a form of freedom, as there's these wonderful tales of people in servitude who for 20 odd years sit there in their cells and they find freedom in and through interior contemplation and so on. Now that's fine, but that's not the freedom they yearn for. Ultimately, the freedom they yearn for is to be free in that way, but also in the way that gives realization to that freedom, concrete realization to that freedom, where the world reflects them. But because in this situation, nothing reflects them. They cannot see themselves objectified in the world at all. They can't identify with anything, and therefore they are in a physical prison and in a mental prison. And this is where the mind goes in the Roman world. And that's why, for Hegel, the period of the Dark Ages is a really dark period. He says some beautiful sentences where he says, the darkest moments of mankind emerge there. Because even the institutional forms of religious worship, which should be the most spiritual, i.e. the most fully self-aware and conscious, are in bondage to corruption, are in bondage to kings, and so on. And so this gives way then for Hegel to Christianity, which imbues the world with that spiritual sense, where we have true freedom of expression and true freedom of worship, where the subject is both free inwardly and outwardly. The Christian world. Where we see in and through the places of worship and the acts of devotion, and in and through the way we live our lives through the commandment of love, where the spiritual content is shaping the world around us, and the world is reflecting us now. Freedom is becoming more apparent because we are recognizing ourselves in and through the world, and the world is not alien anymore. By the time of the Reformation, of course, we have done away with the institutional form, according to Hegel. At least it's been placed, not done away with, but it's found its place within the dialectic, but it's been superseded by a notion of God as painted by beautifully painted by St. John in his epistles as love. Deus est caritas, Deus est caritas est. And so, therefore, we have a world shaped in and through this realization until finally that in turn gives way to what Hegel saw as a flowering of freedom in his own time. And of course, he could only speak about his own time. What he speaks about in terms of the ideal state in the philosophy of right is not the German world. It's very different to the German world of which he was a part, but the German world of which he was a part, obviously in relation to or in contradistinction to the previous epochs of history, was more free, where citizens had a greater realization of themselves as part of the social and political fabric, and therefore freedom had come to its zenith until, of course, the next phase of history. This doesn't go on forever, of course. What we're yearning for is the ideal state, which is, and this is where it ties into the philosophy of right, which is the picture that we get in the philosophy of right, where we totally and fully come home to ourselves as members of the organic community. Now, that's the great drama of history as it unfolds in Hegel. It certainly does not lead to anything akin to socialism, because remember, in the dialectic that's used by Marx, capitalism and the type of social and political and ethical order that Hegel proposes is superseded by the dialectic on the slaughter bench of history and moved on to the socialist world. And therefore it's a rejection of the idealistic world, that the self-conscious world that Hegel proposes. As I've been saying, both in this session, these sessions, and in the book club on Fools, Fraud, and Firebrands, what you get in Karl Marx is a return to one of those earlier phases of consciousness in The Master and Slave, which is that perception of materialism as being the goal of human life, and the social order that it begets, which of course is an order of alienation. Now, in the philosophy of right, we see once again the same thing happening once more. We begin in life in this state of alienation from the political order, and the whole purpose is to bridge the divide between the individual and the social order or the state, or between the individual substance and the social substance, between the universal and the particular, between me and my social world, as it were. And this is a process, of course, that we all have to go through, and it's a process that is realized, and through realizing it, we're growing into freedom. Now, remember what I said in relation when you're thinking of the distinction between Rousseau and Hegel. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Man is born in bondage or alienation. And the whole purpose of the dialectic is to bring him into freedom or into independence and liberty. So you're not born free. It's a ridiculous comment to make, and it's a wonder that it ever got off the ground. But of course, it suits particular purposes, and to say that, and it fires up people, and they get excited at the prospect they've been duped or deluded all their lives, and now is the great revenge on the social order that gave them these delusions. But no, says Hegel, that is utterly wrong. And so here in this book, we have at the beginning, we have the great drama that unfolds between the or the great dialogue, or the great discussion, or the great debate between the individual and the communal, between the liberal and the conservative, for want of better terms. We'll discuss towards the end now why there are these conflicting interpretations of where Hegel stands in relation to our common, our contemporary classifications: liberal, conservative, communitarian, and so on. But for now, it seems to me quite obvious that the whole thrust of his argument is against liberal individualism of any sort, because that is isolationism. And if we've learned anything, individualism and isolationism is the very thing that Hegel is trying to overcome, and which he classifies as alienation. The whole point of it is to reconcile the individual with the whole, to integrate the individual or the particular with the whole. So it's reconciliation, it's overcoming of division, it's overcoming of dualism, it's overcoming of spiritlessness, it's overcoming of estrangement, it's overcoming of bondage, it's overcoming of alienation, all of which isolates the individual from the whole or from his or her kind, so that that individual sees him or herself, recognizes, fulfills the desire of the individual to be recognized in and through the other. It's a reconciliation of self and other. That is not liberalism or anything like it. So, indeed, Isaiah Berlin had this notion of negative freedom, where freedom means the right to be left alone, to do what one wants. Again, that is to separate the individual and his or her desires from the desires of the whole. It's a form of abstract freedom. Hegel would call it abstract freedom. And abstract freedom comes in many guises. Remember, this book is also one of the great critiques of the ultimate manifestation of the French Revolution, which is also another, and it's a very Burkean critique, actually, or Burke's was Hegelian, or Hegel's was Burkean, whichever way you want to put it, of the terror and so forth, which I'll come on to now in a moment. Again, another version of abstract freedom, or armed doctrine, as Burke called it. And therefore, the whole point is to overcome this notion of abstract freedom, this idea that there can be such a thing as abstract freedom, which is not, bondage and alienation masquerading as freedom. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in previous sessions, I've described how in the phenomenology, and in a very important section of phenomenology, in my opinion, Hegel discusses hedonism. And of course, hedonism is, the right to do what one likes, and to be left alone to do that as one wishes, and to exercise one's liberty and license totally. And of course, this is a posture of freedom. Of course, the hedonist is not free. The hedonist becomes an addict, and addicted to his or her personal pleasures. And the pleasures are determined in and through the individual desires and the individual needs, as distinct from the communal needs. Okay, which brings me on to the next point, which is that this is not called the philosophy of freedom. This is called the philosophy of right. Recht, which means law. Best translated if you're an Hegelian. The philosophy of law. Now, law is something different to freedom in that sense. It's something different to freedom as license, and such something different to freedom as kind of unconstrained liberty. It's something different to even John Stuart Mill's conception of liberty, which is the right to do what one likes so long as nobody gets harmed in the process. Again, that's the same abstract freedom that Hegel, or that, Hegel, and negative freedom that Berlin talks about, which of course, and Roger, of course, himself made many mentions of and wrote about consistently in his political works, this idea of harm. What constitutes harm? So there are many things that you may not consider harmful, which may harm me and my religious convictions, let's say. There are many things I may do as a religious person, perhaps, that will harm you as a liberal atheist. They will offend you and therefore harm you. So the definition of harm is one that runs fast and loose. It's not one size fits all. That's a million miles away from what Hegel is talking about when he's talking about freedom in this context. Now you say to yourself, well, a sizable proportion of this book is devoted to a critique of Kant, unsurprisingly, given what we said in our first lecture. But this time it's the Kant of the second critique, the critique of practical reason, more especially the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals. There's a great distinction here you see drawn between Hegel, between morality and social ethics, or Sittlichkeit, social ethics, and morality. Michael Walzer, the political philosopher, the American political philosopher, would make the distinction like this. He'd say it's the distinction between thick and thin. Institutional morality and freedom and law versus abstract morality, universalist, formal morality of the Kantian kind. Now let me explain more fully. As you well know, even from a general sense, even given what we have said, even if you don't know anything about Kant, even what we have said in these lectures, Kant is a universalist. And therefore, he, even in terms of the categories, and even in terms of his view of consciousness, and so on, that we've been dealing with. And the great distinction between Kant and Hegel, of course, epistemologically, is that of the categories, how the categories are not static for Hegel, how they change over time, and thus there's a historical concept now emerges in Hegel, which is not in Kant. The categories are fixed at 12 and so forth and so on. Therefore, and it's universal and objective across the board. So this is where Hegel's great departure from Kant comes in terms of the historical consciousness. But of course, this works its way into the moral theory now, as we'll see, insofar as for Kant, there is only one thing good, truly good, that can be good, and that is the good will, the motivation behind any action. This is beautifully summarized by Kant himself, actually, in a very lucid work called The Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, a very short little text. The Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals. So the good will is the only thing that can be truly good, But and that's, so think of will as one's motivation. And that is because there is a way of purifying the will, the motive, so that it's not driven by impulse or desire, which will leave the subject unfree or in bondage, subject to natural inclination. And that is done simply by these great, what he calls the categorical imperatives. The categorical imperatives. The most famous of which is, the most famous imperative, act only so that your action can become a universal law. It's the universalizability. So whatever you do, ask yourself the question, could this be made into a universal law? If not, it ought not to be done. So the ought, what ought I to do, is determined in and through the universalizability test, the categorical imperative, in other words. And this has the consequence of purifying the will and the motivation of, as I say, desire, natural impulse, or anything that might personalize, as it were, what should be indeed a universal maxim. And this means, or this cashes out in doing what Kant called, this is the practice of doing one's duty. Duty is not doing what you want, it's doing what reason tells you you ought to do through the categorical imperative. And of course, this applies to anyone, anywhere, at any time, in any part of human history. Doing one's duty, purifying the will, determining what one should do in and through the categorical imperative, or through the application of the categorical imperative. And that's how you purify the will. Now, Hegel does not reject this. This is a great leap forward in terms of human freedom, because anything that liberates, the individual, the subject, from the bondage of natural inclination is a step forward in freedom. And you can say that the action is truly free because it's truly rational. It is not in any way determined by, or ought not to be at the end of the tests, ought not to be determined by one's caprices or individual desires or needs. It's a purely formal, universal, dutiful action. So that is good, and it's an imperative stage in the dialectic of morality, and thus the dialectic of law. But there are major problems with it, according to Hegel, and indeed you can see that too, I suspect. And it's this, that number one, the ought is empty, according to Hegel. What you ought to do is empty. Your motives have been so purified that the whole rationale for doing anything, the specifics, the concrete specifics have been drained away. drained away like, like blood, just pours out of you. So the specifics that give concrete motivation to any action are nullified. And the second problem with it is, according to Hegel, and I'm only giving you a very abbreviated version here now because of lack of time, is that it divides the subject from him or herself. There's a constant conflict between reason and desire. Hegel calls it an eternal conflict between reason and desire. And of course, where there's a conflict, Hegel sees the prime opportunity for remediation. The individual is divided against him or herself, and the whole point of Hegel again, and his dialectic, is to reconcile. So what's he going to do? He's going to reconcile the natural, organic, moral life of the Greeks with Kantian morality, basically. Because Kant emphasizes freedom, he emphasizes reason, but to the point where they become meaningless, abstract, and play very little role in the lives of the average person, who has desires, who has needs, who has interests, and is certainly driven in the ordinary run of the round, of the daily round, by more than reason and duty in that formal abstract sense. So now we're going to have a distinction between between duty and responsibility, for example. You can have responsibilities to individuals, to situations, and to circumstances, which are driven by concrete considerations, which will look nothing like responding dutifully in the Kantian sense. And the response, therefore, of Hegel to Kant will be Sittlichkeit, will be social ethics, will be what he calls the social or ethical substance. The institutional life of the state. Now remember, we start off, all of us, in that state of alienation, bondage, unfreedom. And the whole point is to move towards that point where we are so at home in the world, where the desire for self-recognition has been so satisfied through the dialectical engagement between oneself as subject and the objective sphere, that I become it and it becomes I. The I becomes we, the we becomes the I. As Hegel puts it, the I that is we and the we that is I. I see myself reflected in the we sees itself reflected in me, and vice versa. The true is the whole, in other words. Not that the I is going to be absorbed to the point of oblivion in the we, to the point where the I becomes a full rational agent within the we, a full participant in the we, in the community, in other words, and where the values of that community become my own, and where I recognize them as mine, and therefore there's no division between us, where I'm not finding my freedom in any abstract sense away from that, in rejection or repudiation of that. And of course Hegel deals with this, and in our final section now I want to show you how he does that. The great distinction between, as that he draws, between family, civil society, and the state is again the dialectic that occurs within the ethical or the political life of the subject. Again, corresponding to that which we saw in art, corresponding to that which we saw in religion, in history, and in the phenomenology of spirit itself. The bare phenomenology of consciousness that drives all of this, or that is the philosophical underpinnings of all of this. In the family, we are in a state of alienation insofar as we do not recognize ourselves. Certainly the children do not recognize themselves as being members of the state. The state is objective, indifferent. It stands over us as an objective substance with no, and just like the subjects of the ancient Orient, there is no recognition between us and it. None. We do, and to put it in very practical terms, we do as we're told, without why. We're giving no reason. You must do what you're told, etc. So the life of the family, although a very important component of the and a micro model of the eventual state that will emerge, within it, of course, within every model, within every dialectical context, there is that alienation that must be overcome. Of course, the family itself is an ideal model where the child sees itself reflected in the parents, and the parents see themselves reflected in the children, and they see themselves reflected. They identify the home as theirs, they recognize it as theirs, and it is there that they can be free, where we are all free through this mutual recognition. So the family is in microcosm what the state ought to be for us in full maturity. But as I say, there is that moment of alienation which must be overcome. And of course, it happens when the family breaks down, when it divides, when the organic unity breaks asunder, and the individuals, the children, move out, go into the world, and become individual people, particulars. They break from the universal harmony that is the family and are particularized in the world. A necessary stage, form of consciousness is broken down, not because it doesn't correspond to the ideal family or the ideal moral situation or the ideal anything, merely because the desire for self-recognition grows. And the family no longer satisfies that desire as such. And so all these particular agents go into the world seeking to find freedom for themselves. Now, of course, again, at the most basic level, this is the detachment which we see emerging in and through adolescence, which of course is a reactionary sundering. And of course, it's the great insight of the conservative commentators and the conservative philosophers to say that most liberals get caught in this state. And they're forever, therefore, at war with the social substance, to which they never either, they're caught between the family and the social substance, the ethical substance or the state, and they never reconcile to either. They blame the family for all their problems, and then they see the state as a monster, which only reflects the will of the family. And so there's this constant tension, this constant war. So if you want to find where Hegel's critics, liberal critics, find themselves, it's just in that space, which they perceive as pure freedom. But of course, it's not freedom at all, of course, as Hegel points out. It's this abstract freedom that we discussed earlier. And a kind of an irrational phase of life, where rejection, but of course, everything you reject, as you well now know with Hegel, you affirm. The identity of those who engage in this kind of rejectionist form of freedom, which is no freedom at all, the identity is bound up with the very things they deny. They are constantly obsessed about the family, and they constantly obsess about the state. And therefore, their very identity is determined in and through what they oppose. Hegel does not describe this as civil society, but he does say this is the start of civil society. Civil society comprises of, the organs of the state, such as the police, the corporations, and laws. Because now, before one reconciles with the social substance, you're encountering law. You're coming up against law. Now, law can either be a deterrent, and therefore, as Drusilla Cornell puts it, one of the postmodern legal thinkers, therefore a monster. The law is a monster, she says. And you wonder where that trickles down to and who it motivates. But however, the law is a monster, but law is there. And it becomes a fact of life and a feature of life. And the next, the obvious thing to do would be to reconcile, have a reconciliation, a synthesis, a mediation, all these Hegelian terms with the law, which is what most people do. To the point where they fully engage with the social and ethical substance. And they become full members of the state. The rejectionist phase is left behind. They engage with others who participate also in the state and the ethical and social substance through marriage and other constructs that bind the thing together. Until such a time as the individual sees him or herself fully reflected in and through the state, in and through the laws of the state. The laws of the state now no longer stand over and against them, but become part of who they are. There's full recognition. What was the material content of the law and the legal order now becomes fully spiritualized, becomes part of your consciousness. The I becomes we and the we becomes I. The desire for self-recognition in the social world overcomes the moment of repudiation to the point where the I becomes we and the we becomes I. You embody the law, you become an embodiment of the law. Not that somebody identifies the law in you, but they identify you in them and they in you. And through that, we recognize each other as free, autonomous agents that are members of a social world in which we all are integrally, and therefore that the law as such is this spiritual entity which becomes part of that very organization, even in the way that we deal with neighbors. It objectifies our dealings with everybody. Boundaries, basic civility, respect, borders between gardens, borders between states. They are the objectification of the law. Personal space, personal distance, the legal constraints against assault of any description. That means the law is enshrined in me. I am the embodiment of it. It has become totally and utterly spiritualized in me and you. The right, my rights, are determined in and through my participation, my recognition, and my identification with the law. They are not conferred on me from nowhere. And we understand why. We reason through why we belong to the social substance. And we get reasons for our actions in and through the social substance becoming ours. Suddenly our decisions are no longer based on abstract freedom and morality and duty and so on. Now there's something concrete we've got to work on. Our desires take concrete form, but they always factor in the needs, wants, and desires of others, and the legal entitlements of others. Thus, our freedom begins where our responsibilities and duties end. We don't first have freedom, and then, as a tag-along, duty and responsibility. We first have responsibilities because we are part of this organic whole, whether we like it or not. Even if we repudiate it, we still belong to it by virtue of repudiating it and making it central to our identity. It comes first and gives concrete substance to all our actions. Our property is private because ourselves are objectified in and through the property, as is the law. If we are objectified in and through the property and it's recognized as ours, this place we call home, it is because the law is there too, recognized as part and parcel of who I am, protecting and enshrining my right. To trample on my home is to trample on me, but it's also to break the law. It's to violate the law. It's to violate me. The I that is we, the we that is I. The law has become me. I have become the law. You are the law. I am the law. The law no longer stands over and above us, something that we cannot recognize or identify with. Now our identities are bound totally up with it. And we are fully fledged, engaged with the social substance to the point where there is no distinction between us and it. The I has been fully reconciled with the whole and the we. Now, the state that Hegel talks about is not any particular state. It's a state where each citizen is fully engaged with and rationally engaged with the social order to the point where there is no sense of alienation between him or her and all of those others who are also reflected in and through the state, who are recognized themselves as members of this state, and the state, which reflects their identity too, obviously. there are various other elements to it, such as, I say, the constitutional monarchy, which certainly didn't reflect the Germanic state of Hegel, which had an absolutist monarchy, not a constitutional monarchy. And various other things that again, time limits me from saying. But suffice to say that if there were a fully rational, organic community, what you read about in the philosophy of law or the philosophy of right would be it. And where we citizens we are no longer in bondage, because the very things which kept us in bondage now are in us. We have fully identified with them, fully conquered them. They have become our own. And in so doing, the social substance no longer stands over us as a substance, but becomes us. Everything thus becomes fully recognized as ours, as the home in which we live. Now, in case you're thinking, and here we come full circle before I close, that this is something different to what Roger Scruton would have thought, this is exactly what Roger Scruton thought. Exactly what he thought, which is why he always genuflects before Hegel's model of family, civil society, and the state, and why he sees Hegel as the most important of the kind of conservative philosophers, as he said, because he gives to his notion of freedom and to his notion of the conservative state deep metaphysical roots, as he put it. But also because the very critique that that Hegel gives of Kant and liberalism, he too gives in an appendix to the 2001 or 2002 edition, I believe, of the meaning of conservatism, where he has an appendix, a long essay critiquing Kant, critiquing liberalism from the point of view of the Hegelian. Which makes one wonder why, at the end of the day, again, I as like Hegel, I begin from, I end where I started. It comes full circle. Why this fidelity to Kant over Hegel, ultimately? And I think what it boils down to at the end of the day is the love of a philosophical system that retained this respect for the purity of science as a starting point for thought. And a respect for this clarity of philosophical brilliance that we see in Kant, which Hegel also admired, naturally. But Hegel was not prepared to give science that due or that recognition to the point where it became an area of inquiry which stood over and above the idealistic turn which Kant himself had taken, and which, of course, Roger takes himself too. And unless you do fully embrace the idealistic turn, you will not end up, you cannot end up without falling into contradiction. You cannot end up with the ideal situation, political situation that Hegel proposes for us and which Roger himself embraced wholeheartedly. It's a small thing, but I think that at the end of the day, because the great expression of Kant in his works is so just scintillating and brilliant that you can't get away from them in terms of respect and admiration. But the Hegelian model requires you, and the Hegelian way of life, which is a much more conservative way of life, because it's concrete, it's actual, it's lived, it's colorful, it's home, it speaks of self, it speaks of recognition, It speaks of place, of time, of settlement, of change, of history, of belonging. None of which, by the way, belongs to the Kantian system or to the Kantian model. And therefore, it's much more in keeping with the Scrutonian life. I think that at heart, Roger did take the Hegelian turn, except this lingering fidelity to Kant kept him from taking the full public leap, as it were. I have no such compunction. I have come out of the closet, and here I am.